The ledger smelled of damp wool and iron gall ink, and its spine had been cracked and re-glued so many times that the binding had gone soft as old leather on a saddle, pliable in a way that should have been a warning to anyone trained to notice such things. It sat on the long mahogany table in the estate agent's office at Ashwell Park like an exhibit at an inquest, not presented to Louisa Vane so much as placed before her, the way a surgeon places an instrument before a procedure he expects to be unpleasant. The room was cold. Late October pressed itself against the tall windows in a low gray sheet, and the fire in the grate had been lit recently enough that it gave more smoke than warmth. She had been standing for 6 minutes because no one had offered her a chair, and no one intended to. Edmund Fitch, the estate's acting steward, stood with his back half turned to her, one hand resting on the mantelpiece with the studied ease of a man who practices ease. He had a round, agreeable face that he knew how to keep agreeable. Beside the window stood another figure, taller, still, looking out at the park with the particular quality of attention that is not attention at all but the management of a desire not to be present. Adrian Ashwell, 4th Duke of Ashwell, had arrived 10 minutes before Louisa, and had not looked at her once. This, too, was practiced. She had noted it without recording any response to it. The ledger sat between them all like a verdict waiting to be read. "The estate requires an inventory for probate," Fitch said, turning at last, and his voice had the warm, managing quality of a man who delivers bad news as favors. "His Grace's solicitors have specified a formal appraisal of all contents, furniture, silver, documents, collections. The house has not been catalogued since the previous Duke's time. We had hoped to retain Ashworth and Pembury for the commission." He paused. He was about to deliver the line he had rehearsed. Louisa could see it. "Unfortunately, they are engaged until April, and the matter requires settlement by the end of February." He smiled with the full force of both sides of his mouth. "You come recommended by the Whitmore estate. A thorough, if modest, practice. Thorough and modest." There it was. She heard what the words did not say, which was, "We settled for you, and you should know it." The Whitmore Commission resulted in the recovery of 4 provenance disputes and an upward revision of the estate value by £31,000, she said, not to Fitch. To the room, Adrian Ashwell turned from the window. Not all the way. Enough. His eyes, when they settled on her, were the color of water over pale stone, gray and specific, the kind of eyes that are used to finding what they are looking for. He did not find it this time. He found instead a woman of perhaps 30, unremarkably dressed, holding a soft calfskin notebook and a mechanical pencil, who looked at him with the undisturbed composure of someone performing an arithmetic calculation in which he was not the largest figure. Something in his expression shifted by a fraction of a degree. He filed it. "The terms," he said, "are as the letter specified." His voice was level and carried no particular warmth, though it carried no particular coldness either. It was the voice of a man who considered the management of warmth a form of profligacy. "I should add," said Fitch with the smile that was not quite a smile, "that certain parts of the archive are historical in nature and may require a degree of patience with, incomplete record-keeping. Nothing of consequence." He said this to Louisa directly, and it landed the way he intended it to land, which was as a joke at her expense. She looked at Fitch. She looked at him long enough that he stopped smiling by degrees. Then she opened her notebook to a blank page, uncapped the pencil, and wrote the date at the top in a small, deliberate hand. "I will begin tomorrow," she said. "Bright and early," said Fitch. "The best light is at the east wing." He was resuming the smile. "It is gone by 11. She looked at him once more, the particular unraised look of someone who has already decided something. Then she looked down at the page and wrote the first word of her first note. The Duke of Ashwell watched her do this and then returned to the window, and the afternoon went gray and thin around them all, and the ledger sat where it had been placed, and no one knew yet what it contained. I want to say something to you now, before we go further into the house at Ashwell Park and into the life of Louisa Vane. Thank you for staying past the opening, for not needing the story explained before it began. This is a story about being underestimated in a room that does not have enough chairs, about the pleasure of knowing a thing precisely and letting that knowledge speak for itself, and about the particular way two people can mistake each other, and then, very slowly, unmistake. If you have ever been handed a verdict and quietly decided to read it differently, leave me a word in the comments. Now, back to the house. Ashwell Park stood 2 miles east of the market town of Hexthorpe in the county of Northumberland, and in the second week of November it had the look of a large, exhausted creature that had lain down in the long grass and not found the will to rise again. The east portico had lost one of its stone urns to frost damage 3 winters past, and the gap where it had stood was now a stump of rough masonry, bristling with the iron bar that had anchored it. The kitchen garden wall was down in 2 places. The lime trees along the south drive had been neither shaped nor thinned in what Louisa estimated, from the spread and the bark texture, to be at least 12 years, and they grew together now in a long tunnel of interlocking branch that blocked the afternoon light entirely, and smelled, in November, of cold mold and old leaves. She arrived by hired carriage at 9:30 on a Tuesday, and was met at the servants' entrance by a woman of 60-odd named Mrs. Partridge, who was the housekeeper, and who greeted Louisa with a look of steady appraisal, and showed her to a room at the back of the house that contained a narrow bed, a writing table, a window that looked out onto a walled court where a single large ash tree stood, in full November nakedness, and a fireplace that drew well. It was a better room than had been intended for her. Mrs. Partridge said nothing about this, and neither did Louisa, and they understood each other at once. Louisa unpacked her case with a practitioner's economy, the magnifying loupe, the fiber-reactive test swabs, the condition report forms in their manila folder, the roll of archival tissue, the calfskin notebook. She set them out on the writing table in the order she would use them, and then stood at the window for a moment and looked at the ash tree, which was very tall and which bore, near the 3rd main fork, a large bracket fungus of the kind that indicates internal rot in the heartwood. She noted this without sentiment. Then she put on her work apron, took the notebook, and went to begin. The entrance hall of Ashwell Park was a double-height room paneled in oak that had not been waxed in several years, and its floor was a chess pattern of black and white marble tiles, 4 of which were cracked and 1 of which was missing a corner triangle, leaving a dark gap near the base of the main staircase. The hall contained 8 pieces of furniture. Louisa counted them before she crossed the room, noted the position of each relative to the windows and the fireplace, and then went to the first, a side table in figured walnut veneer, the veneer beginning to lift at the right front corner in a bubble the size of a palm, which indicated historic water damage and insufficient humidity control. She opened the single drawer. Inside was nothing but a stub of household candle and, folded flat, a receipt in faded copperplate for the repair of a spinning wheel, dated 1841. She set the receipt aside carefully. Everything had provenance until proven otherwise. She worked through the hall in a systematic grid pattern and then moved to the drawing room, and then the morning room, and she had been working for 3 hours before she encountered the first object that stopped her. It was a small writing cabinet, a secretaire in ebonized wood with marquetry panels, set into the alcove beside the north chimney breast as if it had been placed there to be forgotten. The marquetry was in satinwood and fruitwood, inlaid in a pattern of foliate scrollwork, and 1 panel had been replaced with a newer piece of wood that did not match the grain of the original, and had been stained to approximate the color, but could not approximate the age. The lock had been changed. It was a recent lock, bright brass against patinated hinges that had not been polished in 30 years. Louisa crouched at the level of the lock and looked at it for a long time. She touched the hinges with one finger. She noted the inconsistency in the condition report in language that was plain and technical and did not speculate. She photographed it with the small camera she carried in her apron pocket. Then she stood, made a mark in the notebook's margin that was her private notation for an object requiring further investigation, and moved on. She had found 11 such marks by the time the light failed at 4 in the afternoon. She was alone in the house for all of it. The Duke was in London. No one had come to watch her work, or to assist her, or to question her methods, which suited her entirely. She locked her completed condition reports in the writing case under the bed, left the notebook beside the lamp on the writing table, and went down to the kitchen, where Mrs. Partridge had left a plate of cold meat and bread under a cloth, and ate in the quiet of the empty kitchen, with the ash tree visible through the court window, standing black against the last gray light. Before the story goes forward, it must go backward, because the house at Ashwell Park was not the first neglected thing that Louisa Vane had been asked to enter and make sense of, and the woman who crouched before that bright locked secretaire had not always known how to look at an altered object without flinching. She was born in 1851 in the market town of Shrewsbury, the second daughter of Francis Vane, who had been an auctioneer of modest reputation and considerable erudition, a man who knew the difference between a piece of Sèvres porcelain and a piece of Coalport made to resemble it, and who communicated this knowledge to his children by the simple method of showing them and asking them what they saw. He did not employ a governess. He employed, instead, his own attention, which was patient and unhurried, and which assumed that his children were capable of learning anything that was worth learning. By the time Louisa was 12, she could identify the provenance of a piece of English furniture by the secondary woods used in its construction. Oak drawer linings indicating London or the southeast, pine indicating the north, fruitwood indicating provincial craftsmanship of the preceding century. By 16, she was cataloging sales for her father, sitting at a long table in the auction rooms with a pen and a ledger, annotating each lot with its condition, its probable date, and its reserve. She had a memory for objects that was not quite what most people mean by memory. It was less accumulation than recognition, the particular kind of knowing that does not require effort because it has been built into the structure of attention itself. When she was 21, her father died. He left a practice with a good reputation and a number of debts that his reputation had prevented anyone from remarking upon. He also left Louisa his magnifying loupe, a single lens in a brass frame that had belonged to his own father, and the quiet understanding that she was more capable than anyone in the room had noticed. The debts absorbed the auction house. A distant male cousin absorbed the remainder. Louisa did not contest this. She had been advised by the cousin's solicitors that contesting would be costly and unlikely to succeed, and she believed them, and she went away with the lope and the notebook habit and the accumulated knowledge of 19 years of looking at things carefully, and she set herself up in rooms in Birmingham with a small sign on the door and a card in the window that said, in plain letters, Louisa Vane, appraiser of estates and contents. She had been in practice for 8 years when the commission for the Whitmore estate came to her. The Whitmore Commission, which Fitch had used as a credential and as a diminishment simultaneously, had taken 7 months and had required her to review 1,400 lots of furniture, silver, ceramics, books, and documents, to identify 4 objects whose provenance had been fraudulently assigned, to track those objects to a dealer in Birmingham who had been inflating transfer values, and to write a condition report that was used as evidence in a civil proceeding that resulted in a recovery of £31,000 for the estate. The solicitor who received that report had said to her afterward, in the particular tone men use when complimenting a woman on something they did not expect her to be able to do, most thorough. She had thanked him. She had noted in her private record that his file management was poor, and his secretarial handwriting barely legible. She did not tell him this, because it was not her commission to improve his practice. Her commission had been to read the objects and report what they said. This she had done. And now she was in Northumberland, in a cold house with a compromised secretaire and 11 marginal notations, and somewhere in London, Adrian Ashwell was reading reports from his steward about the appraiser's progress and thinking, if he thought of her at all, that matters were in hand. The village of Hexthorpe in November was a place of practical warmth. Fires banked high in cottage hearths, boots left at doors, the smell of baking bread and wet wool from the cloth merchant's shop. But it had no warmth to spare for strangers who arrived to take an inventory of the great house that employed half of its inhabitants either directly or as tenants of its farms. Louisa understood this without distress. She had walked into cold rooms before. On her 4th day at Ashwell Park, she walked the half-mile to the village to purchase archival board from the small stationers, and the proprietress, a Mrs. Holt, a narrow, watchful woman of perhaps 55, sold it to her without conversation and made change with the emphasis of someone concluding a transaction. The carpenter, whose workshop stood at the end of the lane, did not answer his door, though she had heard movement inside when she knocked. The publican at the Ashwell Arms, when she took her supper there on the Thursday evening, served her correctly and placed her table near the window, which was the draughty table, though the room was not above half full. None of this surprised her. She had written a preliminary letter to the local church wardens requesting access to any parish records that might assist in documenting the provenance of items in the house, and had received no reply. She sat at the draughty table and ate her supper and made notes in the calfskin notebook, and did not show that she noticed any of it. It was on the Friday morning, while she was in the long gallery of the north wing attempting to identify the period of a set of 6 pier glasses by their mercury amalgam backing, a task that required her to stand at an oblique angle to each glass in succession, reading the degree of dimming and the surface texture of the silver layer behind the original plate, that the old witness found her, which is to say that he came to her, shuffling down the long gallery in a pair of felt slippers, breathing with the deliberate care of a man whose lungs had given him 40 years of trouble, and stopped 3 feet away and watched her work without speaking. He was small and very old, his face the color and texture of bark, wearing a suit of clothes that had been good quality in another decade, and had been maintained past that decade with the stubbornness of someone who did not accept the passage of time as relevant. His name, she learned, was Mr. Craddock. He had been gamekeeper at Ashwell Park for 37 years, and had retired to the 2-room cottage in the east courtyard 6 years previously. He was the only person on the property who had been there for the entirety of the previous Duke's tenure. "Those are original," he said. He had a low, unhurried voice. He meant the pier glasses. "I know," she said. "All 6? All 6, she confirmed, and moved to the next one. He watched her. After several minutes, he said, "The last man who did this worked 3 days and left." She kept her attention on the glass. What stopped him? Fitch told him the collection was adequately documented. "It is not adequately documented," she said. "No," said Craddock. He watched her for another moment, and then moved to the nearest chair, an upholstered hall chair in faded red silk damask, and lowered himself into it with the slow economy of a man who has learned to treat his body as a machine requiring careful use. He sat there for the remainder of the morning while she worked her way down the gallery, and he did not speak again except once, when she stopped before a portrait hanging between the 4th and 5th windows and tilted her head at it. "That one's been turned," he said. "Turned how?" "Moved from the library, after the old Duke died." She made a note. She could see, from the wall fixing and the hook placement, and the slight difference in the fading of the silk behind the frame, that it had been moved more recently than the portrait's own settling suggested. The portrait was of a woman, middle-aged, in a dress of considerable quality, wearing a piece of jewelry at her throat, whose details she would examine more closely when the light improved. She marked the notation in her book, the single mark in the margin, her private notation. Craddock watched her make it and said nothing. He did not need to. The inventory of the north wing took 2 weeks. The south wing took 10 days. The library, which contained 4,000 volumes, took a further 8 days, during which Louisa identified 3 incunabula, books printed before the year 1501, bound in boards that had been restruck with a later stamp to make them appear less significant, and 5 letters in a wrapped bundle in the bottom drawer of the library desk that were, by their date and address, correspondence from the second Duke of Ashwell to a merchant in Edinburgh, and which related to a transaction whose nature she did not yet understand, but whose structure, the pattern of payments and the absence of receipts, was familiar to her from the Whitmore proceedings. She photographed these letters without removing them from their wrapper. She replaced the wrapper in the drawer. She made a notation in a separate section of the notebook, a section she had headed, in her private shorthand, the record. She had been at Ashwell Park for 6 weeks when she discovered that the tenants' ledgers did not match the rent rolls. This was not, in the first instance, a dramatic discovery. It presented itself as a numerical inconsistency of the kind that arises from careless copying, a transposed figure, a column summed incorrectly, the kind of error that a diligent estate agent corrects in the margins and dates and initials. The particular ledger in question covered the tenant farms for the southern portion of the estate, 17 properties, for the years 1875 through 1882. The rent rolls for the same period were filed separately, in a bound volume in the estate office, and when Louisa set the 2 documents side by side on the writing table and compared them column by column, a task that required 3 hours and a good lamp, and the kind of sustained attention that most people find impossible to maintain, and that she found as natural as breathing, the discrepancy resolved itself not as an error, but as a pattern. Across 47 entries spanning 7 years, the amounts recorded in the ledger as received from tenants were consistently lower than the amounts recorded in the rent rolls as charged. The difference was not large per entry. It ranged from 8 shillings to £2.03. But it was consistent, directional, and, in total, amounted to £314 across the 7-year period. £314 was a significant sum. It was also the kind of sum that could be removed from a set of accounts without attracting attention if the 2 documents were never compared side by someone who had no reason to protect either of them. She did not draw any conclusion from this in her condition report. She noted the discrepancy, gave the entry numbers, stated the total difference, and referenced both documents by title and location. Then she moved to the next ledger, which covered the northern farms. During these weeks, Adrian Ashwell came to Ashwell Park twice. The first time he arrived in the afternoon and spent 20 minutes in the estate office with Fitch before departing. She heard his carriage. She did not see him. The second time was a Monday in mid-December, when the frost had sealed every puddle in the courtyard to gray glass, and the ash tree in the walled court had a single crow balanced on its highest visible branch, black and still against a white sky. She was in the estate office herself that morning, with the permission of the housekeeper and the knowledge that Fitch was in Hexthorpe until noon, reviewing the condition of the older ledgers by assessing their physical properties, the gum Arabic content of the ink, the chain line spacing in the paper, the wear patterns on the covers that would indicate frequency of use or deliberate concealment, when she heard boots on the stone flags of the corridor, and the door opened and Adrian Ashwell stood in the doorway, and his eyes found her immediately, which suggested that he had been told she was there, and then found the open ledger on the table in front of her, and he was very still for a moment in the way of a man reorganizing what he had expected to find. "I want to thank you for staying with this story, and with Louisa, through a December morning and a door that opened before she was ready. Some stories need to be slow to be true, and this one is that kind. If you are still here, you already know that. Please consider subscribing to this channel, not because I will ask again, but because the next thing that happens in that estate office is the thing this entire story has been building toward, and I would like you to be there when it does. We are more than halfway through, and the document in Louisa's hands is about to say something that no one in that house is prepared to hear. The morning held itself in the particular suspended stillness that follows a hard frost, when the cold has done its work and the day waits, and the estate office smelled of old paper and damp stone, and the residual smoke of a fire that had been lit and not tended. Louisa did not close the ledger. She did not rise from the writing table. She looked at Adrian Ashwell with the same quality of attention she had given the pier glasses, reading the degree of wear, the surface detail, the distance between what was presented and what was original. He was, she thought, a man of about 35, which was to say only 4 years older than herself, though his self-possession gave him the appearance of a greater distance. He wore his authority the way old furniture wears its patina, not displayed, not polished, simply accumulated. He looked at the ledger and then at her, and the question he might have asked, "What are you doing with those?" did not arrive, because he saw that she was working, and the precise, methodical arrangement of the documents on the table told him something about the nature of the work that a less observant man would not have read. "You have found something," he said. It was not a question. "I have found several things," she said. "I am recording them. In order of significance, in order of discovery. The significance is a separate record." His jaw moved slightly, which was what his face did, instead of changing expression. He crossed to the other side of the table and looked at what she had open before her, which was the 1878 ledger, and at the rent roll open beside it, and at the small column of figures she had been transcribing into the condition report. He was close enough that she could see the small scar at his jaw, a pale crescent, and the way his right hand, resting on the table's edge, pressed down as though testing the solidity of the surface. "How long has this been here?" he said, not of the ledger, of the discrepancy, of whatever the ledger was telling him. "The earliest entry I have found so far is 1875, she said. "Possibly earlier. I have not completed the review of the archive." The silence had a texture to it. "Fitch manages the accounts," he said, and it was less a statement of exculpation than a statement of consequence. The statement of a man who has trusted the wrong mechanism and heard, for the first time, the sound it has been making. "Yes," she said. She did not add anything to this. He looked at the documents for another long moment and then straightened, and his face had resumed its level, unreadable quality. But there was something behind it now that had not been there before. Not distress exactly, and not anger. Something more like the discomfort of a man who has understood that he has been standing in a room without seeing it. "Continue your review," he said. "As planned," she said. He walked to the door. At the door he stopped, and without turning. "Miss Vane." She waited. "The locked secretaire in the north drawing-room alcove. Do you have a record of what it contains?" She had not been told to open locked pieces. That was a standard limitation of an inventory commission. Contents of locked furniture were generally listed as unknown pending probate access. She had photographed the altered lock and the inconsistent panel. She had made her private notation. She had not pushed the question. "I have a record of its exterior condition and a notation regarding the lock," she said. "It has been changed recently." Another silence. "I will arrange access," he said. He left. The crow on the ash tree had not moved. She watched it through the window for a moment, sitting black and particular against the white sky, and then she turned back to the ledger and the rent roll and the column of figures, and she continued. The secretaire, when opened, by a locksmith brought from Newcastle at the Duke's instruction on the Wednesday of the following week, contained 3 things. The first was a package of 12 letters bound with tape, addressed in a hand that was not Edmund Fitch's but that she had seen before, in the Edinburgh correspondence in the library desk, which identified the writer as Geoffrey Ashwell, the previous Duke. The second was a small cash book, hand-bound in red leather, which was not an official account of the estate, but a private record of transactions, payments made, amounts received, in a neat, secretive hand that she required 20 minutes of comparison against the estate ledgers to identify as Fitch's. The third was a deed. It was a document of conveyance for a parcel of land on the northern farm boundary, 16 acres of good river meadow, dated 1879, transferring ownership from the estate to a holding whose registered address was in Edinburgh and whose named beneficiary was a person she had not encountered in any of the official records. The registered beneficiary was Edmund Fitch. She photographed every page of every document. She handled the cash book with archival cotton gloves and turned each page with the particular deliberateness of a person who knows that what she is touching is both fragile and irreversible. She inventoried each item, the letters catalogued by date and addressee, the cash book by entry count and date range, the deed by its registry number, and added them to the condition report under the heading Estate Archive, Miscellaneous Documents, with a subnotation that flagged the items for legal review. She did not take any of the documents from the estate office. She made a true copy of each page in her own hand, in her private record, and she locked the original documents in the secretaire and returned the key to the locksmith's envelope on the estate manager's desk, where Adrian Ashwell would find it when he returned from Hexthorpe. Cradock had told her once, in the gallery, watching her assess the condition of a gilded console table whose gilding had been partially stripped and relaid with a different gold content, that the old Duke had sold several things in his last years that the family would not have expected to find missing. He had said it in the flat, direct way he said everything, not as accusation, not as information offered for effect, but as the statement of a person who has held a fact for a long time and found it growing heavier. She had made a note and filed it. It was only now, with the deed in front of her, that she understood what Cradock had been describing. The 16 acres of river meadow had been sold, by arrangement between Fitch and the late Duke, at a recorded price of £40, which was below any credible assessment of its agricultural value, and the deed had been constructed in such a way that the conveyance appeared to be a gift from the estate rather than a purchase, a distinction that would have made it extremely difficult to contest under ordinary circumstances. The cash book suggested that £40 was not the only amount involved. It was not the first transaction in the book, and not the last. The book ran from 1873 to 1883. There were 41 entries. She counted them with the care of a woman who had been counting all her life. The news of what Louisa had found reached Adrian Ashwell in a report she sent, through Mrs. Partridge, to the house in London by express post on the 20th of December, a Thursday. The report was 9 pages in her small, precise hand, with cross-references to the corresponding entries in the official ledgers and the dates and locations of each primary source. It was written in the language of estate appraisal, transfer value, conveyance instrument, discrepant entry, chain of custody, and it was as careful and as plain as everything she had ever produced, and it contained, at its close, a single sentence that was not technical language but was its own kind of precision. The evidence contained in this archive indicates a systematic diversion of estate funds and assets across a period of not less than 10 years, the full extent of which cannot be determined without a thorough review of records held by the Edinburgh Property Registrar. She signed it with her surname and her professional designation. She did not hear from him for 3 days. On Christmas Eve, Edmund Fitch came to the house. He arrived without announcement at the back door at 8:30 in the morning, while Louisa was in the kitchen taking her breakfast, and Mrs. Partridge showed him to the housekeeper's parlor with a look that communicated something between warning and satisfaction. Louisa went. Fitch was standing in the center of the small room with the controlled, smiling quality of a man who has decided upon his approach in advance and is committed to it. He wore a good wool coat, freshly pressed, and he had combed his hair. He said that he had been informed of certain claims in the preliminary report and wished to clarify a number of points. He said this in a tone of warm, reasonable concern. He said that some figures in the old ledgers were the result of a notation system used by the previous Duke's accounting firm, and that Louisa, not being familiar with estate accounting practice of that period, might have misread what was in fact a standard convention. He said this in the tone of someone delivering a correction to a well-meaning student. She watched him. He was wearing the smile like a garment he had put on that morning and expected to have some use from. She said, the notation system used by Barrage & Sons, which was the firm employed by this estate until 1876, used a superscript mark above entries for which a receipt had been independently filed. I reviewed all 47 discrepant entries. None of them carry that mark. Fitch was very still for a moment. Additionally, she said, the conveyance document for the North River Meadow is dated February 1879. Barrage & Sons ceased their engagement with the estate in November 1876. Whatever notation system they employed has no bearing on a document produced 2.5 years after their departure. The smile went, not all at once. It went the way fog goes, thinning, losing its substance, leaving the surface of the face visible and harder than expected. You have overstepped your commission, he said. His voice had a different quality now. My commission is to inventory and report the contents of this estate accurately, she said. I have done that. There are things in this house, Fitch said, and he dropped his voice to something that was meant to carry a threat within its reasonableness, that do not require this kind of attention. She looked at him with the particular level look that was her only answer to that kind of statement. Then, they should not have been here when I arrived, she said. She left the room. She went directly to the writing table and added, in a dated note at the end of her private record, a full account of the conversation, including the exact words used, the time, and the physical manner of the man, which she described in the terms available to her, controlled, then not. The proceedings that followed did not resemble the proceedings of a novel. There was no confrontation in the great hall, no raised voices in the library, no document thrust across a table in triumph. There was instead a solicitor from Newcastle who arrived on the 27th of December with a colleague, and who sat in the estate office for 2 full days reviewing Louisa's reports and the primary sources she had catalogued, and who issued on the 29th a letter to Edmund Fitch's legal representative requiring the preservation of all estate records and the suspension of Fitch's authority over the estate accounts pending investigation. Fitch retained a solicitor in Hexthorpe who wrote 2 letters disputing the interpretation of the conveyance document, and who then, on reviewing the cash book with his own eyes, wrote a 3rd letter that was much shorter than the first 2. The Edinburgh property registrar was contacted in January. The 41 transactions in the cash book were each examined against property and transfer records. 38 of them were confirmed. The total diversion, across 10 years of Edmund Fitch's stewardship, amounted to £942 and the 16 acres of river meadow. Adrian Ashwell was present for none of the formal proceedings. He was in London for the first portion, then in Northumberland for the second, and Louisa saw him twice during the 2 weeks of the solicitor's review, once in the corridor outside the estate office, when he stood aside to let her pass with a courtesy that was exact and undemonstrative, and once in the long gallery on a gray afternoon when she was completing the final condition assessment of the pier glasses, and he came in and stood at the far end of the room and watched her work for perhaps 5 minutes before she turned to acknowledge him. He said, "Your report will be introduced to the Chancery proceedings next month." "I understood it might be," she said. "It is thorough." He used the word deliberately. She understood why. It was designed to be thorough, she said. He walked the length of the gallery toward her. He was not a man who did things quickly, and this walk was the same. Measured, without the performance of authority. Simply the movement of a man covering ground. He stopped within a proper distance and looked at the pier glass she had last been examining. His own reflection looked back. Fitch told me in November that your review was proceeding satisfactorily, he said. He told me you had found nothing of concern in the tenants' accounts. She said nothing. He looked at the glass for another moment. I relied on his reports, he said. Not as an apology, as a statement of fact from which a conclusion could be drawn. Reports are only as honest as the person who writes them, she said, which was the plainest version of the things she had been finding in this house for 3 months. He turned from the mirror. He looked at her directly, with the quality of attention she had first seen in the estate agent's office in October when she had named the figure of the Whitmore recovery, and she thought that he was, when the certainty fell away from him, a man whose face had more in it than she had originally seen. Not warmth exactly, or not yet, but the capacity for it, the way a room has the capacity for warmth before the fire is lit. Mr. Craddock tells me, he said, that the 6 pier glasses are original. They are, she said. He told me also that the frame of the 3rd one, measuring from the north, has a crack in the gilded slip that has been in-painted with a color that does not quite match. He had been listening to Craddock. He had been paying attention in the way that people do when they have finally started to. The in-painting is competent but recent, she said, probably within the last 5 years. It does not affect the value significantly. I have noted it in the condition report. He nodded. He started to turn, and then he stopped, and he said, without looking at her, I was wrong about several things. It was 4 words more than she had expected from him, and fewer words than the subject deserved, and she thought that he knew both of those things, and that the saying of it was therefore a greater effort than it appeared. Yes, she said, most people are. In October. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was the nearest thing she had heard from him. Then he went, and the gallery held the cold gray light, and she turned back to the last pier glass and finished what she had started. January settled over Ashwell Park like a considered decision. Not the sudden cold of the early winter, but the sustained, deliberate cold of the interior of the year. When the ground is sealed, and the light comes low and flat across the park, and the lime trees along the south drive are black against white sky, and every morning is the same pale instruction. Louisa had been in the house for 94 days. She had catalogued 2,342 individual objects and documents, identified 6 significant provenance disputes, recorded the systematic discrepancy in the tenants' accounts, documented the contents of the secretaire, and produced 11 complete condition reports. Fitch's formal removal from his post was confirmed on the 14th of January in a letter from the solicitors to all parties. He did not contest it. He left the village before the end of the week, and the cottage he had occupied on the estate's grounds was cleared and locked, and Craddock watched the removal of his furniture from the window of the old gamekeeper's lodge, with the expression of a man watching a weather pattern that he had predicted for some years. Louisa's commission was, in formal terms, complete. She had been told as much by the solicitors, who wrote to thank her for the thoroughness of her documentation. She could have left Ashwell Park at the end of January and returned to her rooms in Birmingham and considered the matter concluded. She did not leave. Adrian Ashwell had asked her in the 2nd week of January, in a letter written in a spare, exact hand and delivered by Mrs. Partridge rather than posted, whether she would consider remaining to oversee the formal probate inventory, the next stage of the process, which would require the appointment of a certified valuer for the 63 items she had flagged as requiring specialist assessment. It was a professional request. It was phrased with the precision of a man who knows that the professional request is not only professional and who does not know, yet, what to do about that. She read the letter at the writing table by the window that looked onto the walled court, where the ash tree stood in its January bareness, the bracket fungus at the third fork still and gray in the cold. She thought for a time that was longer than the decision required. Then she wrote back accepting the commission. She told him that she would require access to the Edinburgh records directly, rather than through the solicitors, for the purposes of completing the provenance work. She told him that she expected the full inventory to take until April. She said this in the plain, technical register of a professional correspondence. She signed it Louisa Vane, appraiser. He replied the next morning, which was faster than a letter sent from London had any right to arrive, which told her that he was in Northumberland, and had been when he wrote. The reply accepted all of her conditions. It added a sentence at its foot, below the formal closing, in a slightly different pressure of the pen, as though written after a pause. Mr. Craddock says the ash tree in the East Court is sound, despite appearances. I find this encouraging. That was all. She held the letter for a moment longer than was required, and then she filed it in the back of the calfskin notebook, behind the private record, in a section she had not previously used. Then she opened the next folder of documents and began the morning's work. The ash tree caught the early light through the window and threw its shadow, thin and branching, across the stones of the court in a pattern that looked like a hand laid open. In the long gallery, the 6 pier glasses held the same gray January light they had held for 130 years, and the whole house breathed around them, not repaired yet, not restored, but understood, catalogued and witnessed and set into the record, in language that was accurate and would hold. What a person knows and what they are believed to know are two different objects, Craddock had said to her once in the gallery, watching her work. She had written it in the notebook. She would write it again, later, in the final line of the final report, not as a conclusion but as an observation, the kind that does not need to argue its case, because the evidence is already in the room, and has been all along. Thank you for watching all the way to this last room in the house at Ashwell Park, and to the ash tree casting its shadow on the stones, and to Louisa filing a letter in a notebook she keeps close. I read every comment on this channel, and I would love to know, where in the world are you watching from tonight? And did this story remind you of anything you have quietly known for a long time that others were slow to see? If it did, tell me about it below. If you have not yet subscribed to this channel, this is the moment. Not because I am asking urgently, but because there are more houses, more ledgers, more women who know what they are looking at, and I would like you to be there when the next one opens the door. What a person knows and what they are believed to know are two different objects. The question for you, when this is over, is which of yours have been waiting to be found?